I'm Scott L. Miller, and welcome to Sam IT. Today we're going to take up something that's been in the news really recently, and that is the release of the Apple M1 processor, and of course the Macintosh line of computers based around that processor.
It's time to talk about the Mac.
Now with M1, these technologies are combined into a single SoC. M1 unifies its high bandwidth, low latency memory into a single pool within a custom package.
NTG, supporting business and technology globally since 1999.
Now, this has been kind of beaten to death in the news, and every day I see another news story about it because it's kind of the hottest thing that has happened in the last 6 months to maybe a year, maybe more. This is actually pretty big news, but I'm not sure it's as big as people realize. And I think a lot of people are getting distracted by the wrong things. So I want to run through a little bit about this because it is incredibly important. Now I want to preface this by saying I don't have one of these devices, but I am going to get one because for the first time in a very long time, I feel that the Apple Mac ecosystem is looking really interesting. Not that it was bad before, but it was kind of blah for the last about 17 years. When Apple was first releasing OS X in late 1999, part of what was making it really exciting was that was the time when Apple was making the shift from their M68000, that is the 16 and then later 32-bit Motorola architecture that they started with in 1984 that made the Mac ecosystem rather unique in those early years, and it was more closely aligned to Commodore Amiga and the Atari ST families than to anything we see today. When OS X came out, the move was to the PowerPC architecture based on IBM Power. That was really interesting, and I was excited about both the operating system moving to Unix based on FreeBSD at the time, and the processor moving to IBM Power under the hood. Unfortunately, during that era, OS X was very nascent and there was a lot of growing pains that were happening, so the software was a little bit less than desirable, and the PowerPC turned out to be an incredibly anemic processor. Even though the Power architecture was amazing and remains amazing today, 20 years later, it's still probably the fastest single processor that you can buy. It costs a fortune and no one is using it anymore, but IBM, it's the only thing they use even now. The early Macs based on OS X turned out to be rather lackluster. Even though they sold really well, they got beaten down pretty badly in the market for being really, really high priced and incredibly slow and poor to just overall, just a poor experience and very bad application compatibility. So Apple moved to Intel world, IA32 and later AMD 64 processors. When they did this, they became a PC. And that's another discussion to really delve into what exactly a PC is. But during this era, Apples were PCs. Just for quick reference, the term PC has to do with the hardware architecture and has literally no ties whatsoever to Windows or anything of the sort. Early PCs predate Windows. Windows became a major operating system for PCs. PCs are not related to Windows. It's the other way around. When Mac went to their Intel-based computers with no AMD direct options, they actually became, in many ways, the most PC of any ecosystem because they were 100% PC. Every other ecosystem was just almost 100%, if at all. So during the Apple PC era, which followed the PowerPC era, we had, again, high-cost devices that were faster than the PowerPC era, but they were no longer interesting because they were now just generic hardware for the most part at a high price. The operating system did improve a bit, but overall, it just wasn't that exciting. If you like it, you like it. If you didn't, you didn't, but it wasn't anything super unique. There wasn't a really great value proposition to any of it, short of, if the software really did something you needed and made a difference for you. Today, what has changed? Well, first of all, during the last 20 years, Apple has reinvented itself and its primary ecosystems have become the iPad and iPhone families. And those are ARM-based, completely different architecture than either PowerPC or Intel, right? Or i32 and AMD 64. And of course, completely unrelated to the really old Motorola M68000 family. So the ARM family is today actually the largest processor family on the market. There are more computers built every day using ARM than on AMD 64 or anything else. Pretty much ARM and AMD 64 rule the roost. If you're looking at embedded devices, that may be different, but when you're looking at real end user computational devices or servers, these are pretty much the only two games in town. Technically, Power is still a player, Spark marginally still exists, MIPS can be purchased, but you're getting into extreme niche markets. For normal computers, what normal people buy, ARM and AMD 64 are completely dominant at more than 99.99% of the market. So ARM is what we use in cell phones universally. There's, for all intents and purposes, no exception to this. With the iPhone and the iPad, Apple long ago made the decision to invest really heavily in making their own processors. This was really interesting in the iPad and iPhone world because they were able to do things that no one else was able to do, and we had an inkling for quite some time that they were going to move towards somehow unifying their iPad and Mac families. It was going to be very hard to do. But we knew this was likely to come because, let's face it, macOS has kind of gotten more like iOS, and iPadOS has become more like a Mac. So the opportunity for these two to stop overlapping and start sharing code has gotten better and better over the years. What has happened recently is that Apple has a new processor, part of their existing family, but with a lot of new technology in it, called the M1. And they kind of surprised everyone with this. No one is surprised that they had a new high-power ARM processor. That we knew was coming. The degree to which this is a high-power processor, that's what's shocking. Apple came out of the gate with a processor that we expected was going to be just enough for the Mac to limp along until they got better and better over time, but that they would spend their energy focused on a vertically integrated ecosystem that would eventually be advantageous to Apple users. And it might be cool, but it wasn't going to knock our socks off, at least not for a while. That is not what happened. Apple came out with what is possibly the best processor on the market. It's not going to stay that way for long, but the numbers that come with this processor are mind-blowing. And you'll see a lot of different conversations in the news about this, and media outlets are reporting all kinds of different performance numbers. On one hand, you'll get one that says this is the fastest processor by 50%. It's so much faster than anything else on the market. And then the next article will say that's a bunch of hooey. This is not a very fast processor at all, and here's why. They're missing the boat on this or whatever. It's important that we sit down and talk about this because the M1 is mind-blowing. It's super important, and if we understand why it's really performant, and why people are confused about it and reporting that it is not performant, we as IT practitioners can then use that information in a useful way. So first of all, it is ARM architecture. That means it is not an AMD 64 processor. We have to compare apples to apples, or in this case, apples, Apple to not Apple, when looking at this, right? When we're doing a performance of a processor, under all normal circumstances, we're doing things against benchmarks. These are computational. So, and they may be designed to mimic the way that applications work, but they are still math-based or IO-based at the end of the day. They are not running a specific application. Testing a specific application is useful if you run that specific application in that specific configuration at this specific time. There's a reason we don't do that, because applications change every day. What runs poorly today could be really fast tomorrow because of a major change. And since the M1 released, something like Microsoft Teams didn't run at all on release day because it just couldn't handle it, and now runs great. That didn't take very long. It's only been a couple weeks. So had we benchmarked that, we would have really misleading information. So that's why we use generic benchmarks to test the performance of the processor. They don't test the performance of a specific software package. When we do this, you'll still see people saying, well, Apple claims it's this much faster than other things, and it's making this claim, and they're not very well substantiated. Granted, Apple did a terrible job of stating exactly how they came up with their numbers for their claims. That's a mistake. They were very ambiguous, and they allowed people to really speculate heavily. We assumed they were doing things very liberally and that the processor was impressive, but that they were, pushing it a bit to make a point and for marketing, because you're allowed to a certain degree. But when we ran real-world benchmarks against the M1, it turns out Apple was being really conservative and using exactly what you would expect the marketing numbers to have been targeted at. The M1 is actually faster than Apple was saying, not slower and not even the same. It's really fast. So from a pure performance standpoint, the M1 is mind-blowing. It's crazy how fast this is. Apple made such a leap in the market. This is going to fundamentally change a lot of the way that we approach hardware in the future. So this is really exciting from just a pure hardware power perspective. But now we need to look at what we're seeing from all the complaints that things are slow. Almost universally, what people are complaining about is something to do with the architecture. Either that they're complaining that it can't run things that they want to run because what they say that they want to run is AMD architecture software, or they are using an emulator and saying that when they emulate that software, that the application is slow. Well, of course it's slow. Anything that runs through an emulator is going to be way, way slower than it is natively. That's why you don't run emulated software unless you absolutely have to. If we were to take the same workloads that are native to the M1 or to ARM in general and run them emulated on AMD 64, they would also be incredibly slow. So if we're comparing the same thing in each direction, the M1 remains faster. The only time that it's slower is when we're contriving a situation where we want to run something from the AMD 64 world. We don't want to have it in, or can't get it in, native M1 ARM code, and so have to emulate it, and so that software is slower. But apples to apples, the M1 remains much, much faster. It is also, for those who are looking to move to the M1, it is a temporary solution or a temporary situation that we needed this solution for. The fact that there aren't as many pieces of software written and compiled for the M1 ARM architecture yet is just obvious because it just came out a few weeks ago. Any new computer that comes out is going to be lacking in software for some time until companies have a chance to make it for it. That's just the nature of things. If Apple had not provided an emulator, we'd be having a completely different discussion. Instead of it being, oh, it's slow for some workloads, people would just casually point out that this is a new architecture and you can't run software from other architectures on it. That's all they would say. And in fact, we can show this. The world's #1 best-selling computer is the Raspberry Pi. I have one sitting right here beside me. The Raspberry Pi is like the new Apple family. It is an ARM 64-bit processor. Not anywhere as fast as the M1, but it is the same general architecture. Is it fast? It's fast enough. It's impressively fast for how cheap and low power it is. The M1 is in a completely different ballpark, but the Raspberry Pi is still a pretty decent machine. Can we emulate AMD 64 applications on top of it? No, it does not come with an emulator to allow you to do that. That's a lot of really complicated programming, and while there might be someone somewhere who has made some kind of emulator that you could put on it, it certainly doesn't come with one, and no one talks about it, because if you tried to do so, it would run so poorly that there would be effectively no point to it. So we don't have one. Nobody talks about performance in that way with the Raspberry Pi. When talking about Raspberry Pi performance, they are firing up the same application on each one, compiled natively for each one, and comparing the actual performance of the hardware, not some aspect of the software where one was compiled differently and has to be emulated and all kinds of a mess. Because Apple is giving us this additional option that they don't have to give us, but because they're offering this Rosetta 2 emulation layer, people are using that as an excuse to effectively falsify benchmarks to make it sound like it's slower than it is. It is an extremely fast computer. You may not like ARM architecture. You may not like Apple products. You may not want to move to Mac. Those things are fine. I'm not an Apple fan myself. In fact, I generally am pretty unhappy with their products. Some I really like, some I really dislike, some fall in the middle. I am anything but an Apple fanboy. I use an Android phone. I run Ubuntu on AMD 64 white box desktops in most cases, right? I have a Raspberry Pi. I have had no Mac of my own for 17 years. But I am going to get a Mac Mini M1 in the next few weeks because Apple is making an effort. Apple has made an amazing leap in hardware. They have what they are claiming is the most significant leap in their software that they've made in 20 years. While that may or may not be true, we're going to give them the benefit of the doubt and say that they are at least making an effort on that side as well. They are, from the benchmarks, showing that they are doing absolutely amazing things. This is an opportunity to look at Apple products again on the desktop, on the laptop, and say, this is a change, right? They're doing something interesting, they're doing something important, and they're giving us variety in the ecosystem. For the last many years, almost 17 years at this point, we've been dealing with almost everybody has been stuck running PC. And not that that's bad. The AMD 64 world has been very, very good over the last 17 years. Ever since AMD came out with their 64-bit extension to the IA32 ecosystem, we've had some really great computers. In fact, they've gone so fast that we've stopped really worrying about making our processors faster and we started worrying about making them use less power. That's a pretty cool spot to be at. The only thing that has come along in all this time that made anybody on any scale stop and take notice was the Raspberry Pi. And to be fair, it didn't get a lot of traction. It may be the best-selling computer out there, but it's mostly used as a hobby device. Now, the Raspberry Pi 4, which I will talk about in another video, and especially the Raspberry Pi 400, are a little bit of a game changer in the Raspberry Pi ecosystem, that they're starting to be really viable as a full desktop. Okay, so Apple was not the first one to have an alternative to PC architecture in the last 17 years. But the difference is the Raspberry Pi is just starting to be good enough to be considered for entry point for really special use cases. The Mac Mini and the MacBook Pro and the MacBook Air with the M1 are at the top end and broadly useful for almost all workloads. Certainly there are things that cannot run on Mac. That has always been the case. But Apple's really giving us an option within our desktop ecosystems to choose hardware, not just software. And that's pretty important. We have competition again. We have an opportunity for innovation that has not been seen in a number of years. So I'm really excited about that. And it's worth noting, lost in the news of how amazing the M1 is right now, the RISC-V world is actually trying to eclipse that, but they don't have as much money as Apple, and they don't have flashy new products like the Mac Mini to show off at conferences, so very few people are talking about the fact that RISC-V just broke the 5 gigahertz barrier and may have set new records for per watt performance numbers, all on an open source chip. So that's really exciting too. We're seeing some cool stuff happen. It's not only in Apple, but the Apple M1 is truly amazing hardware. It may not be for you. It may not be for your company, but it is not something to be overlooked. It is worth considering, and it is worth understanding that it is a valuable, amazing engineering accomplishment, if nothing else. It's also worth noting a few things about the M1. I'm going to get a little bit under the hood real quickly with this chip. One is that it has integrated memory. This is important because it actually takes a look at more traditionally embedded systems where they're putting the RAM chips directly on the processor itself, onto the same silicon. This allows for typically not lower cost. There's a lot of cost involved with this, but it allows for a much smaller footprint within the board. It is easier to cool. And most importantly, it gives vastly better speed because you don't need a bus to talk between the different components. It does mean you can't expand a system after you have purchased it. So you will notice within the Mac line, they try to warn you now. If you need 16 gigs of RAM, you must order it at the beginning. You cannot upgrade an 8 gig unit to a 16 gig unit. Can't be done. We're used to this in the Raspberry Pi world and other embedded single board computers. We've long had it that we couldn't expand the RAM. You had to buy the unit that had the amount of RAM that you wanted. overall, this has kept the price lower. With Mac, it may not quite do that. RAM has suddenly become very expensive because of the incredible high speed of the chips that they're using and how incredibly small they are, but it does give us a higher performance system. RAM speed is a really significant contributor to overall system performance. That's the first thing. The second thing is they claim this. I've not seen numbers to back it up, but their other claims have gone pretty heavily substantiated, is that their software GPU that is built into the M1 is the market leader, that this is the best of the software GPUs that we have had, or integrated GPUs, right? There's not a separate GPU processor. It's all built into the same CPU. Intel and AMD both make similar units, but Apple is claiming that theirs outperforms those. And it's very possible that it does. ARM has good GPU within their own designs. Apple has been ahead of ARM on their own variant of ARM for many years, and they have to put a lot of research into this because their iPad family and their iPhones depend on that GPU. It's the only option for all of their 3D rendering. So Apple has a lot of experience in the GPU game as well as the CPU game. And so they're saying that this is a culmination of that research over many years, all in the same chip. So it's amazing memory and this amazing CPU and this amazing GPU all in one place. And then because they have this unified CPU, GPU memory architecture, they are able to have the CPU and GPU share RAM. And this is different than what we're used to. If you're in the traditional Intel world and you have say 8 gigs of RAM and a CPU that is using shared RAM for that, you have to give, say, 1 gig of that carved out to the GPU and 7 gig carved out to the CPU. And if the CPU needs to talk to the GPU, it may have 512 meg of image file or whatever that needs to be processed, and it has to transfer it from the CPU RAM over to the GPU RAM, which takes time, and it is duplicated. It has to exist in the CPU RAM and the GPU RAM at the same time. So not only did we take our system RAM and split it into 7 and 1, we then have the same data in each duplicated. We're losing a lot of our overall RAM utilization in doing this. With Apple's M1 design, all of the RAM is shared. So if the GPU only needs 800 meg, it doesn't take 801 meg. It only takes exactly what it needs. And anything that is going to be shared between the CPU and the GPU does not have to be transferred. So that entire process of transferring large amounts of data between the two memory locations no longer happens. That's a lot of speed improvement, and it doesn't need to be duplicated. Instead, the CPU simply tells the GPU, or vice versa, where to look for the information, and they share the same memory space transparently. They're able to look at the same locations. This is hard to explain just how much memory efficiency in how much memory you need is changed by this, and how much performance is gained by this. This is a big piece of why the M1 is so fast. So that is a really, really important under the hood component as to why the other pieces end up the way that they are. But it's really interesting that that's some of the innovation that Apple is bringing to the table. Now, none of those technologies are specifically new. ARM RISC is old. Shared CPU, GPU is old. Integrated unified RAM is not exactly old, but not new. But putting them all together in a commercial package that is so accessible and usable, that is new. So Apple is commercializing on a grand scale something that is mostly been on the research side primarily in the past. What is not available at this time is dedicated GPUs like an NVIDIA card or a Radeon card to go with an M1. That is expected to be coming in probably the next few months on higher end units from Apple, but for the time being, the M1 is limited to the M1 is what you get, right? There's only one package. You can't upgrade it in any way, even by adding an additional card. So that is another way that we have seen people doing benchmarks say that the PC is able to outperform it. Well, of course, right? You can get PCs with multiple really large server processors. You can get many very high-end GPUs, and of course when we do that, that is going to blow the M1 out of the water. But when we're looking at things like per core performance and price performance and single chip performance and integrated GPU performance, we are seeing benchmarks that say the M1 is dominating the market, and That does not just mean in technology terms. We are also seeing its sales numbers so high that it is actually dominating the market. In fact, it looks like they took Japan from something like 14% to 30% market penetration by Mac in 2 weeks, which implies, based on the numbers, that really close to 100% of all personal computers, not PCs, but personal computers purchased in the country in that 2-week period were all Macs. Of course, there were some that weren't, but it was like above 95% to be able to shift the market that much in such a short period of time. There's not normally that much computer buying in that amount of time to shift the market that much. So it's really interesting. So I know that the M1 and the new Macs are a big topic. I know that everyone has a lot of opinions. Put them below. I want to hear, right? And subscribe so you can come back here and we'll follow up on this in the future, especially after I have one. And, you know, please like and support us here on the channel. But if you have the new Macs, I want to hear how they're working for you. What do you have? If you're interested in it, ask your questions. You know, follow up. I think that this is gonna be a great topic, especially, and I know that there's gonna be people who just love Windows and people who love AMD 64 and people who love macOS. That is to some degree the nature of things, but I think this is an opportunity where Apple has created a product that allows, for the first time in a long time, a more transitional period where people who are in the middle and are really looking for just great technology to be able to consider it in a way that they weren't able to consider before, or at least not incentivized to consider before. Thanks for joining me. I'm Scott Allen Miller. I will see you next time.